Barry. What an absolute honor to have you in the studio with me today. I'm a tremendous fan of yours, and your work is just fantastic. I mean, your TED Talks, you've done so many. You have millions that watch your TED Talks. You have a message that we all need to hear. So thank you for coming. Thank you for agreeing to talk to me today.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. You're very kind.
Well, can you tell my listeners, they've heard your amazing bio, but can you tell my listeners and viewers just a little bit more about yourself and maybe something that's not in your bio, and why do you do what you do? What motivates you?
Well, so a long time ago, I took an introductory psychology class not knowing what it was because it fit into my schedule as a college freshman. This was in 1964.
I was 1 year old then. I was just born.
And my teacher was a guy named Philip Zimbardo, who was quite a world famous psychologist. And it just got me so excited that from that day on, I was a psychologist. I took everything I could as an undergraduate. I went to graduate school, got my PhD, got a job teaching at a place called Swarthmore College outside of Philadelphia, a very selective liberal arts college, and spent 45 years there. And then retired and moved west to be closer to my kids and grandkids. And now I do some teaching at Berkeley in the business school.
Oh, wow.
But the reason I've always been so interested in psychology is that it has seemed to me that it really asks, at its best, it asks the most fundamental questions about what human nature is, what people are like, what we can expect of them, what circumstances enable people to thrive, what circumstances give people great difficulty. And I think you can't understand the world without understanding human psychology. And that was true when I started. And I suppose if this were physics, by now we would have made enough progress that wouldn't still be true. But we haven't made the kind of progress one would like, although we have made progress.
That's
so
true.
It's endlessly fascinating.
It is an endlessly fascinating. I agree with you. It was one of the courses that I did as well for 4 years, along with other courses. And it's a fascinating field, and it's going through a lot of challenges at the moment, the field of psychology, especially with the research and things. But you focused on a very, very interesting, so many different areas, and you've published so extensively, and you've done, as I mentioned already, so many TED Talks. You have grabbed people's interest in your work, and I love all your books. And I wanted to start off with the one, Paradox of Choices, and why more is less. And you argue that eliminating choices can greatly reduce anxiety. And this, I do a lot with mental health, and I cannot agree with you more, but you just have a way of explaining this that's fantastic. So can you talk about this book and your research on choices and how having less choices is actually better for our mental health?
Sure. So, psychology has long known about the importance of freedom and autonomy to well-being.
Yes.
People want to be the masters of their own fate. This is true when it comes to buying cereal at the grocery, and it's true when it comes to choosing a career, a place to live, romantic partners. We want to make decisions.
Yes.
And there's just no debate about it, and it's been known for half a century. But the assumption that psychologists have made is that if freedom of choice is good, which it is, then more must be better. If anything is good, more of it must be better. And that's a perfectly reasonable assumption to make, and that turns out not to be true. Flood people with options, both the number of options in any given area of life and also the number of areas in life where there are options. Instead of liberating people, you paralyze them. You overwhelm them. People can't pull the trigger. So the work that first started to show this, was done now almost 20 years ago, and I just jumped on it. I had thought a lot about the importance of freedom and autonomy. I'd thought a lot about what's good and bad about having societies organized on the basis of free market principles so that people can make choices and everything. And here was evidence that freedom, the benefits of freedom had limits. When you give people too many options, you don't make them free, you don't liberate them, you paralyze them.
So interesting.
And, the original studies were about trivial things like choosing jam. People go into a store, a gourmet food store, and there are 24 jams on display, and they can sample as many jams as they want, and you ask what percentage of those people actually buy jam, and then a few days later you just put 6 jams on display, and you ask again how many people buy jam, and it turns out that 10 times as many people buy jam when there are 6 on display than when there are 24.
That's amazing.
It is amazing. And,
but it's logical, kind of logical too.
It's one of these things. I think a lot of the great discoveries in psychology seem obvious after somebody has made the discovery.
Exactly.
But they're invisible until somebody has made the discovery. So yes, it's logical. And, so I wrote a book about why it is that too much choice, produces an inability to decide, increases the chances that when people do decide, they'll make bad decisions, and also makes it likely that when people decide and make good decisions, they'll be less satisfied. They'll be thinking that maybe some other option would have been better than the one they chose. So I wrote a whole book about it. And, it's the reason that my TED Talk got so many viewers and the book got so much attention is that once I said it, everyone went,
that's the thing.
That's why I'm being driven crazy every day when I go shopping. I thought it was me. It's not me. The world is torturing me. So
the world is torturing me with choices.
It has gotten a lot of attention, and your audience should know that when I wrote this book, the internet as a source of commerce was just getting started.
Oh wow!
And so it was a problem then. It is an orders of magnitude bigger problem now.
Yeah, it's crazy now.
Back then you go to a shop to buy a couple of tops. Nobody buys bottoms anymore since nobody can see the bottom half of your body.
Yeah, with COVID, we just have to buy nice tops. That's true.
You don't have to buy T-shirts. You don't need T-shirts. So, you go to a store to buy a couple of shirts, and they have however many they have on display, and you don't love any of them.
Yeah.
Are you going to get into the car and drive across town to go to another store? Maybe not. Maybe you'll settle for whatever is the best of what's available in that first store. But now you can shop in 1,000 stores without ever leaving your living room.
Exactly.
So when do you stop? And the answer is you don't stop. So that's what the book was about, why it paralyzes people and why it produces dissatisfaction even when people manage to make good decisions.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about why it paralyzes people. You've given us the big picture, so dive in. Why does it paralyze and what is it?
Think about just buying cereal again. What matters when you buy cereal? What's most important? Is it what it tastes like?
Yeah.
Is it its nutritional value? Is it its caloric content? Is it its price? You go to the supermarket, there are multiple things that you're thinking about, and you encounter 250 different kinds of cereal. How long will it take you to
pick each one up? And
you look at every box, you read the ingredients, you'll starve to death before you choose one. And that's a simple thing. Choosing a job, that's not so simple. Choosing a romantic partner, that's not so simple. If you grow up in the olden days where you meet a small number of people who happen to live in your neighborhood or went to your school or work in the same place of business you work at, your choice set is reasonably limited. But in these days where you can swipe left and right, your choice set essentially includes everyone in the universe. So what are you looking for in a romantic partner? You want somebody who's funny and somebody who's kind and somebody who's empathetic and somebody who's a good listener and somebody who's really, really good looking. Well, how long will it take you to choose that person? And you finally find someone that person looks pretty good. You're thinking, yeah, but there are thousands of other people out there. Surely I can do better than this. And so you live your life alone.
So it's a constant state of dissatisfaction. You're just never satisfied.
Or, well, you're in a constant state of uncertainty. When you finally do decide, you get something, and let's assume it's a pretty good something. Is it a perfect something? Well, is there anything that's perfect? No. And so, but when there's only one alternative, you're not so bothered by the fact that the one you've chosen isn't perfect. When there are 1,000 alternatives, you're convinced that somewhere out there is the perfect one. And so you end up dissatisfied with what you've chosen, not because it's bad, but because you're just sure that somewhere out there is something better. And the result is that even when you make good decisions, after putting in an enormous amount of time and effort, you're sure you made a mistake. You're unprepared to commit. And in a lot of things, cases about things that are bigger than cereal, the extent to which you commit to your decisions really matters. So, you're 18-year-old, you go to college. Is this the perfect college? Who knows? Who knows what the perfect college is?
Yeah.
You're uncertain about it. If you're kind of always looking over your shoulder, thinking maybe some other place would have been better, you won't throw yourself into the college experience to the same degree that you would if you were confident that this was the right place to be. And what happens as a result of that? You don't throw yourself into it. You get a lot less out of it. And so every day you get more and more evidence that this is not the right place for you. Is there anything wrong with the place? No. What's wrong is your inability to commit to the place. And I think the same thing is true when it comes to romantic relationships. If you're not prepared to commit to your partner, it's not going to be nearly as rich a relationship as it would be if you were fully committed. Right? You have these romantic couples, and each of them, they're together, sitting at a restaurant, facing each other, and she's looking over his shoulder to see if somebody better is walking by, and he's looking over her shoulder to see if somebody better is walking by. This is not a recipe for a successful relationship.
No,
you're plagued with dissatisfaction, even with good options.
Wow.
When there are thousands of other options out there to be explored.
And there's that frustration that you cannot get to all those other options, but there's always this hanging over your head that there's something better. And as you say, that stops that level of commitment, so you can't enjoy anything. So our level of enjoyment has dropped. Our level of satisfaction has dropped.
And, and if you make a decision and then, you order grilled salmon in a restaurant, you're eating it. And would you order it again next time? Well, it depends on how much you enjoy it. But if how much you enjoy it depends on how much time you spend thinking about whether the chicken would have been better, you're not going to enjoy it as much. And so you walk out and you'll tell your friend, I wouldn't go there. The salmon's just okay. The salmon's better than okay, unless you're thinking all the time, bite after bite, that some other alternative would have been giving you more pleasure. So I should emphasize the problem that we're talking about is a rich people's problem. It's a first world problem.
It's a champagne problem.
It's a champagne problem. In most places in the world, for most people in the world, the problem remains that there isn't enough choice in life. Not that there's too much, but in the privileged environments that, I have spent most of my life blessedly living in.
Yeah.
It's a problem of abundance and not a problem of absence. And it really breaks my heart to see incredibly talented, enthusiastic young adults who have had every advantage in life come to college miserable because every day they're convinced there's really some other thing they ought to be doing in some other place. And they go through college and they leave college just as uncertain about what path to follow as they were when they entered. Not true of everyone, but it's true of a lot of people. And, psych services in selective colleges and universities are bursting at the seams. Mm-hmm. They can't meet the demand of the most privileged, most talented people who ever lived, all of whom are walking around depressed and anxious. I don't want to suggest that this overabundance of choice is the sole explanation for this, but it is a part of the explanation. And I should also emphasize that, 6 months ago, the world was different. The world you and I are talking about is the world from 6 months ago.
Exactly.
And I assume the world from 6 months or a year from now. In the world we currently live in, feeling that our choices are limited is accurate. I mean, they are.
Yes.
We all feel hemmed in. We all feel constrained. Though, again, some of us are less affected by COVID than others.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of stuff that we are not free to do now. But that's not how it was a short time before, and it's not how it's going to be when the world
reopens again.
And so I want people to appreciate that what I was writing about and what we're talking about is a feature of yesterday's world and tomorrow's world, even if it's not a feature of the world we're living in at this moment.
Well, that's actually true, but there's also that legacy. We've got into such a habit of being dissatisfied. It's almost like it's a society of dissatisfaction. And if you look at the self-help industry and the positive psychology movement and the whole sort of positivity movement of people are constantly looking for something to make themselves happy. And that's also a bunch of choices. So you're unhappy in this choice, and then you go into the self-help world and find a whole bunch of, there's so many more choices there, and it's an endless amount of choices. So in a sense, we would you not maybe think, the way I've been kind of approaching this whole quarantine time and the change in thinking is that the lid has come off. So we have to start facing a lot about ourselves. We have to start tapping into our own inner wisdom. We have to start thinking more deeply and dealing with stuff that we didn't have time to deal with before. But now we've got a bit more time to start dealing with stuff and making choices about our own lives, and kind of that less choices on the outside is making us look inside a little. So maybe it's a good thing.
It may be a good thing. The question is, do we have the resources to do that kind of self-examination and come out of it better, stronger, more satisfied people? And I don't know the answer. It's people develop habits of acting in the world and of thinking about the world. And I'm not sure you can snap your fingers and break those habits. So there's a lot of research on what's called negativity bias.
Yes.
So bad things have a bigger impact on us than good things do. So what's salient now is, what's salient whenever you make a decision is the respects in which it falls short. And the aspects of it that are good have less of an impact. Mm-hmm. So, the salmon is slightly overcooked, and you walk out of the restaurant, no matter how much you've enjoyed the meal, and all you're thinking about is that they overcooked the salmon a little bit. So at this moment, what's most salient to us is all of the things we have had to give up temporarily, and the opportunities that have been opened up for those of us who are lucky enough to have those opportunities is much less salient. We focus on what we're losing, on what's bad, more than on what's good, which is why one aspect of this positivity movement you're talking about is to encourage people to develop the habit of being grateful, or of focusing on aspects of their lives that they should be grateful for. You don't need to encourage people to be displeased. People do that without any prompt.
They pay that attention. It grabs their attention very quickly.
It grabs their attention. You do have to encourage people to pay attention to what's good. And it's a vacuous sort of truism, that you have a lot to be grateful for. I know, of course I have a lot to be grateful for, but if only they had cooked the salmon better, So it turns out there's research to suggest that being grateful is itself a habit that you can cultivate. If you make a point at the end of every day of identifying 2 or 3 things that happened during the day that really were good, that you have reason to be grateful for, that becomes more and more natural. And you start noticing the half full glass more and the half empty glass less, essentially automatically. And it seems insulting to people that they need to develop a habit of being grateful, but we do. I know all this stuff, and I still find myself focusing on what I didn't like about the movie I just watched, instead of what I did like. It takes practice.
I've been doing research on sort of the mind-brain interaction, as I've mentioned, for 38 years, and I do clinical trials, whatever. And I just did one recently. One of the things I've been looking at for years is the whole concept of how long does it take to form a memory, or to form a thought and a habit. And, a thought that's long-term, and then it's got to be converted to a habit. And it does take, there's been, as we know, there's been the myth of 21 days and that kind of thing. And I wanted to really look at that. And it actually takes at least 9 weeks before you have turned something into a habit 21 days more or less to build a long-term memory, and then at least 9 weeks to build a habit. So if we think of people now in the current climate, is we've removed people's choices, like you say, their choices have limited. We've had a few cycles of 9 weeks where we can start looking at life differently. So I think it's interesting. People have shifted, and you can almost see it in social media. I can see it in the work I'm doing and just the contact that I have with people through the platform I have. Is there's a shift where people have gone from woe is me and the focus on a lot of the negative to encouraging each other to look more at the positive, which is actually quite a nice thing to see that shift. And another thing I wanted to just throw out there, it's something that I've had a discussion with a few psychologists. I wanted to see what you think. I know we talk about the negativity bias. I've studied the brain for years, but I don't think it's a negativity bias at all. I don't think humans have a negativity bias. I think we have a positivity bias. And if you look at the neuroscience, we all our circuitry and everything, all our cells, everything about the brain and the body is wired for health, for upliftment, etc., literally wired for love. So if something is out of that norm, so it's something like COVID or something like multiple choices that make you feel this disturbance, or the 20 comments you get on Instagram posts and 2 are bad, and your attention is drawn to the bad. I think our attention is drawn to the bad because it's so abnormal and because it's away from the normal, and that's what's drawing our attention, which is a slight shift. And I think you kind of said that as well in terms of when people at university, for example, they've got all these universities to choose from, and then they choose whichever college they go to, but they're not sure if they should have gone there or there, and the top 3 choices, and they never really throw their minds into it. So there's that whole mindset. So the way people are thinking about things is affecting how they are moving through the day and how they're making new choices.
There's just no question about that. There's a New Yorker cartoon that I sometimes show when I give talks about this work, of a young woman wearing a university sweatshirt, and the sweatshirt says Brown, very, very distinguished university in Providence, Rhode Island. Brown, underneath it in smaller letters, but my first choice was Yale. Now, that's cute. It's funny to have a sweatshirt that says that. But the question I ask my audience is, imagine going through 4 years at Brown with that sentence in your head.
Oof, you would never get, You
wouldn't get anything, a fraction of what Brown has to offer if every day you're thinking your life would be better if only you were at Yale, which is, first of all, not true.
Yeah, exactly.
But it doesn't matter if you think it's true, then you're just not going to take advantage of what Brown has to offer, which is a lot more than any one person can possibly take advantage of in a stint at college. So, maybe you're right that the reason that the negative has such an impact is that we notice it because it's unusual. But whether that's the reason or not, what seems incontrovertible is that we notice bad.
Exactly.
And the result is that they get weight that's disproportionate to the importance that they actually have in our lives. Now, look, really bad things happen to people.
Exactly.
I'm not suggesting that we should turn a blind eye to suffering, our own or other people's. Mm-hmm. It's just, you can't treat slightly overcooked salmon as, sort of on a par with losing a loved one. You need a certain amount of perspective and scale. And what I worry about is that people have kind of lost it. Maybe the duration, when the COVID first started, a lot of people asked me, is this going to produce a lasting change? And I said, who knows? I said it partly depends on how long it lasts. If this lasts for 2 months and then the economy opens up and people go back to living their lives, probably within a week, there'll be no evidence that this ever happened in the way people go through life. Well, it isn't lasting 2 months. It's surely going to be with us for a year. It may be with us for more than a year. Yeah. And it's quite possible that that's long enough for sort of fundamental aspects of how we act in the world to be altered. And then when things do open up, it will turn out that it is opening into a different world because we have become different people. I still don't think you can know that, but it seems to me possible that something that lasts as long as this will have relatively permanent changes, will make relatively permanent changes in what people care about and what they seek when life goes back to some version of normal.
Very interesting. And so if we take your point of view, which is, I totally agree with, that too many choices, this abundance of choices has paralyzed us and done so many different things to our psyche, which is not very positive, where people just constantly live in a state of dissatisfaction and uncertainty, which is, and I'd love to talk about how that affects mental health in a moment. But just to come back to COVID and kind of wrap that part of the discussion up, if we've reduced choices, do you not think that the possibility exists that we're going to improve in this arena, that because our choices have been limited, we're going to have a bit more, we've learned to almost slow down and appreciate and smell the roses again. And so this could be a positive little hiatus in humanity.
It could be, but then it ends and
the rush starts.
The wheels of commerce start up again, and we go out shopping, and there are all those different kinds of cereal. And how long does it take for us to go back to being the way
those
we were
habits
before it started? And I think it's a completely open question. I think we will re-enter that world differently than we left it, but I'm not confident that the world won't suck us back into being the kinds of people that we were, because everything about the logic of consumption and markets sort of pushes us in that direction. So, there will be a lot of pressure for us to go back to being the kind of people we were before all of this started.
So it's going to be a very conscious and deliberate effort on the part of the world of abundance that you speak about, to actually not let that fall back into place, that people can, because you also speak a lot about value and morality and wisdom and that kind of thing, how that's been affected by the current market and the current overabundance sort of philosophy and all these choices. How do you think all of this combination, let's talk a little bit about that, a little bit about the wisdom and values and how that's been affected by choices and free market.
Okay, so I did write a book some years ago called The Costs of Living. And the thrust of that book is that despite all of the good things that market competition has brought us, there's no question that a good part of the world lives with a level of material abundance that no one could ever have dreamt centuries ago. Despite all of that, and it has led to a belief that the most efficient and effective way to give people what they want is to make it available on the market. Let people choose the things they want. Let them buy the things they want. Don't impose anything on people. And people will get more and more of what they care about for less and less. And what I argue in this book, The Cost of Living, is that markets have their place, but that place isn't every place. Buying jeans or cereal on the market is okay. Buying education, not so much. Buying healthcare, not so much. Buying romantic partners, not so much. There are other aspects to life that involve, sort of wanting to be a certain kind of person in the world, wanting to treat other people in a certain kind of way, doing work that you think makes a positive contribution to the lives of others that markets don't capture. And when markets start to encroach on these other aspects of ourselves, these other aspects of ourselves erode. And so it quickly becomes, in almost any situation, is it worth my while? So there's a term that has become common in the age of Donald Trump in describing relationships, and people talk about relationships as, quote, transactional, which is a very antiseptic term for what's
something
in
so
it for
creative.
Me. What's in it for me?
Yeah.
I'll do something for you as long as I get something back. What's in it for me? That's not the relationship you want to have with friends.
No.
That's not the relationship you want to have between a teacher and a student.
No, not
between
at
a parent and a child, between romantic partners. It's not what's in it for me, it's what's in it for you. What can I do to make your life better? That's my objective as a teacher, as a parent, as a friend, and as a romantic partner. But you get this sort of transactional orientation. You walk into a store and you assume that they're there to rip you off. They're going to try to sell you more than you want, and it's worth less than what you're paying for it. So you have to defend yourself. That's a terrible attitude.
Terrible way.
With you into your relations to the people in your life or even into your work. And so the point of the book, The Cost of Living, is that we have been overly enthusiastic about this transactional approach to life. And the result is that it is wrecking our close relations to other people and our relations to our work. So the market is good, but it needs to be bounded.
Yeah, there needs to be boundaries.
Other aspects of our lives can be cultivated. And, the argument is that we'll be happier and the world will be better if we keep the market in its place.
I love that approach. That's why I wanted to bring that up, because I've heard you speak about that, and I just think it's vitally important that people understand that transactional, as you say, it's very clinical. It's very not at all indicative of what a true relationship should be. So you've got to limit what the market delves into. You even gave the example of in the medical world as well. You can't have that kind of transactional relationship in medical health, as well as it sort of crosses the boundaries as well as it does into relationships.
But you can sort of see it in the U.S., which is sort of stands alone in terms of the way healthcare is provided. You read all the time about drug companies and physicians and hospitals making decisions based on bottom line.
Exactly. Get the surgeries in whether people need it or not. Yeah, it's like you got to get X amount of surgeries done to get X amount of money in the hospital.
Exactly. And, so it's interesting because one of the things that COVID did, there are several cities around the world where at 7:00, some point in the evening, people open their windows and they bang on pots to celebrate frontline workers who are enabling us to live our lives, not just in the health, in the medical settings, but
all of them
who stock the shelves of our stores, who serve us, and so on. It's like, and we call them heroes. What bothers me about that is that they were just as much heroes before COVID as during COVID.
Wow, good point.
And we don't treat them as heroes. I mean, doctors get pretty well treated.
Yeah.
But we don't treat the people who restock shelves as heroes.
Wow.
We pay them terribly. They get no benefits. They're basically invisible to us. And now, because of this crisis, we clap our hands in appreciation. And when the crisis ends, they will go back to being
invisible, which is unacceptable.
And so, we were talking about this a few minutes ago. It's an opportunity for us to change how we are in the world.
Yeah.
If it produces a lasting effect, then when we go to the grocery store, we will see the people who are making it possible.
And say thank you.
And respect them and demand that their employers treat them properly and pay them properly.
Yes.
I'm just not optimistic that this attitude will persist when the crisis is over.
Oh, I'm so glad you raised that. It's such a valid point that you've raised, and something that we need to think deeply about. And like now, as we need to change racism and not just let it slip back into under getting rid of a Confederate statue, we need to definitely get into a changed mindset about everything. I'd love to just come back to the choices again and talk about, this society. You mentioned something earlier on that is so relevant, that societies of great abundance, where individuals are offered more freedom and choice, personal, professional, material, etc., than ever before, are witnessing an epidemic of depression. I've heard you speak about this, and this is an area that I work in a lot, and I talk about depression just to give you a bit of background, as not as an illness, which is very much the neuroreductionistic approach that society has currently. The sort of gold standard is it's an illness and it's with symptoms that you must get rid of. I rather see depression as, and it's actually very much more scientific, depression, anxiety, etc., as a signal or a warning sign that when you embrace it, there's something underneath there. There's a message behind it that something's not right in your life, that you need to deal with, a trauma or maybe too many choices or whatever. So I'd love to link the concept of too many choices in an overabundant society to depression, anxiety, and so on. Could you talk about that?
So, and what I'm about to say is mostly speculative, but I'm not shy about speculating. So one of the arguments in my book about choice is that how much of a problem having a lot of choice is depends on your aims when you make a choice. So my colleagues and I distinguish two categories of people, and there's not a bright line that separates them. People who want the best, we call such people maximizers. The best restaurant, the best pair of jeans, the best school, the best job, and so on. Only the best will do. and people who want good enough. We call them satisficers. Good enough doesn't mean that you'll settle for anything. You can have very high standards, but as soon as you encounter something that meets those standards, you stop looking. And so imagine going to a grocery store where there are 250 kinds of cereal. The maximizer has to look at every single one. How else do you know which one is the best unless you've examined all the possibilities?
It's exhausting, just the thought of it.
It is completely exhausting. I mean, it didn't used to be 100 years ago, but the world we live in now, it's not even exhausting. It's impossible. You can't do it. The satisficer, who might have high standards, will look at these cereals, and as soon as he or she finds one that meets those standards, stops looking. Doesn't matter that there are another 100 varieties that I haven't examined. This one is good enough for me. And so in a world of hyperabundance, being a satisficer is a lifeline.
That's where your peace will come.
Peace will come. Searches will stop. You can be satisfied with what you've chosen and not worry about what you have left behind.
So good.
So what we have found, we developed a little questionnaire to sort of assess whether individuals are more like maximizers or more like satisficers.
Yeah.
And what we have found is that people who score high on maximizing are borderline clinically depressed on paper and pencil measures of depression. And so when I give talks about this, I suggest that too much choice can contribute to the problem of depression. That's part of why. If you are out to find the best, you will be experiencing one experience after another, one choice after another will be disappointing and leave you with doubt about whether you've made the right decision and whether you're a good decision maker. And the cumulative effect of that, nothing is ever good enough. I am a failure. All my decisions lead to disappointment and regret. It's hard not to get depressed under those conditions. So now I have no real empirical evidence that there's a causal relation between being a maximizer and being borderline clinically depressed. We just have scores on questionnaires that suggest it.
I tend to agree with you there totally, because one of the aspects we looked at in my most recent trials was looking at how people change when they feel empowered. So my whole approach to mind and stuff is to help people to become more self-regulated. And when you're more self-regulated, you're going to make better choices and you're going to know how to become, as you say, a satisfier. What did you call it? Someone who's satisfied. Satisficer, I love that word.
I didn't make that word up. I borrowed it from a very distinguished economist, and it's
a good word. It's a good word.
I've been regretful ever since because people think I had to invent a word that nobody can figure out or even pronounce when there were perfectly good alternatives. So anyway, satisfier works. Satisfier.
So what I found was that when I made in our experimental group, when people became more aware, like we looked at narrative, we looked at psychological measures, we looked at some of the traditional measures. I also have developed a scale that looks at people's ability to self-regulate and the awareness of that self-regulation. But the biggest part of the psychological measures for me was the narrative, just see how they see their life and so on. And then we also looked at physiological measures, blood and DNA and all that stuff, a lot of different measures. And then we also looked in the brain, we looked using QEEG to see the responses. And what was very interesting is when people introduced them to mind management, self-regulatory mind management techniques that I've also developed over a long period of time. The point that I'm making here is that when people became aware of how they were running their life and how they were responding, and that would lead to the choices, it would lead to the multiplicity of choices about the work. If I think of their narratives, the choices at work, the choices in relationship, the choices with friendships and so on, all the different choices, a lot of them felt that they were barriers and challenges and didn't know what to do, which kind of goes to your dissatisfaction or uncertainty. They felt very uncertain about what to do with him. But once, and the control group just got worse and worse. So the more we made them aware of them self-regulating their choices, the worse they got without mind management. The experimental group that we gave mind management to, where they then felt empowered to look at the toxic effect of maybe toxic choices and toxic stress, and then that a barrier and a challenge is something that I can actually do something about. And so they felt that they could kind of almost, I think, limit their, choices maybe. And I hadn't thought of it like that until I spoke to you now, but because they spoke a lot in their narratives about making decisions and changing how they make decisions and that kind of thing. But we saw a significant improvement in brain function, in things like physiological measures, not just, we saw causative links between increased mind management, increased empowerment, increased ability to recognize I can see this as toxic, I can manage the toxic effect, I can face those barriers and challenges. As they got into that mind management mode of self-regulating their choices, their cortisol levels dropped significantly, their inflammation in their body dropped significantly, even down to the telomeres on the chromosomes were increased in length, and this was in sections of 9 weeks at a time. So that was quite fascinating, just to support what you're saying there. I agree with what you said about the satisfier who's making choices, that they can accept the choice and then not have to jump and wish for something else.
Well, it's terrific that you've actually got techniques that help people think about their choices in that way, because, in the years since my book originally came out, I've gotten hundreds and hundreds of, emails from people, sometimes sounding sort of desperate.
Yeah.
They
I can imagine.
They're appreciative because I put a name to their problem, but I don't, I can't help them. I'm not I'm not a clinician, and B, I'm not going to deliver clinical advice by email. I think that your insight is a good one. It seems unthinkable to settle for good enough when the best is out there.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the word settle, when you hear somebody say, well, I settled for this, that's not a neutral word. That's not a mere description.
True.
The word settle has negativity built into it.
True.
I could have done better, but I settled for this. And what I'm trying to suggest is that settling is a good thing.
I like what you're saying.
Not a bad thing. But it seems unpatriotic, un-American. Why would you go to the 8th best school when you can go to the best school? As if these rankings mean anything.
Oh gosh, it's such a different concept. It's a totally different looking at quality versus quantity almost, even if that's the right way of using it.
But it takes work to get into the habit of seeking good enough and feeling comfortable when you get good enough. It's not automatic. Everything about the outside work is pushing you in the opposite direction. So you have to kind of really be resolute and know that it's a much more rational way to live your life and a much more satisfying way to live your life.
I agree. I think it's brilliant. It feels so right, and it just makes so much sense. Let's pivot to another idea. How does your research relate to the idea of ignorance is bliss? In that the less we know, or the less options or choices we know, the better. Do you think how do you feel about that?
Well, I think real ignorance is not bliss.
No.
There's a
balance, a nice fine balance.
There's a 6-ton semi coming at you. You sort of want to know that it's coming, right? Ignorance is not bliss, but this notion that the bad decisions we make or the dissatisfaction that we have with the decisions we make would be averted if only we knew more. That is, the problem with our decisions is that we were ignorant. We didn't know enough. Give me more information. Let me read all those reviews on Amazon before I decide what toaster to buy. Let me read all those reviews on Airbnb before I decide where to spend my long weekend. This is the road to lunacy. There is that we don't suffer from inadequate information, and getting more of it is not going to necessarily going to make our decisions better. You might make a different decision if you have more information, but you'll probably also be less satisfied with the decision.
So you almost need to put a cap on it. It's like you said in the beginning, is more isn't necessarily better. So, and ignorance isn't bliss. It's to find that middle of the road.
Bliss, I think, is not a good way to live your life. But there can be too much information. And it's sort of like when 9/11 happened. A lot of questions arose about whether the U.S. security services should have known it was coming. You have all these spy organizations collecting massive amounts of data. Should they have known it was coming? Now, after it happened, you look at what was out there and you say, yes, they should have. There was this, there was this, there was this, and there was this. Why didn't they see it? Well, of course, they did see it, but they also saw 6 million other things.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, I see your point.
Knowing after the fact what mattered is easy. Knowing in advance what matters is not so easy.
2020 is always what hindsight's always 2020 vision.
They were drowning in information. They were overwhelmed with data. Now, maybe they should have seen it. I don't know. I'm no expert. But the mere fact that it seemed obvious after it happened doesn't mean that it
was obvious in advance.
Anyone before it happened. And the other problem with too much information is, and I make a big point of this in the book, when we have an experience and we evaluate it, we don't have an absolute standard to judge whether this was a good meal or not. When we make our judgment about this restaurant meal, what we're asking is, was this as good as the last meal I ate in a restaurant? Was this as good as I hoped it would be? Was this as good as I expected it to be? And the more information you have, the higher your expectations. The more you know about what's available in the restaurant across town, the less satisfied you're going to be with the choice that you made. And so in that sense, having some blinders on is almost certainly going to make it easier for you to appreciate the choice you made instead of beating yourself up for not having made a different choice.
So it's almost like being able to live in the quality of the moment, the quality of the now moment, and make it work.
Quality of the now without worrying too much about, buyer's remorse is there's something good about buyer's remorse. You won't make the same mistake next
again.
time. On the other hand, there's something terrible about buyer's remorse because you'll think you made a mistake even when you didn't make a mistake.
Yeah, there you go, and it can permeate so many other things. Well, let's just talk about based on that. That's kind of can make people feel it's decision-making anxiety. So, what would you suggest? Maybe is just some strategies to help people when they are sitting with choosing that Airbnb, choosing that cereal, choosing that pair of jeans, whatever, choosing that, and then those are the practical, then the bigger decisions.
I have a few suggestions. One,
fantastic.
Remember that good enough is almost always good enough. Stop looking for the best. That's, I think, the single most important thing. Two, choose when to choose. What do I mean by that? Sometimes, instead of doing all of this searching yourself, call up a friend. You need a new cell phone. What kind of phone should I get? You can spend 3 weeks burying yourself in information, or you can call your friend who recently got a new cell phone and say, did you like it? Yeah,
brilliant advice.
Well, get the same damn phone.
Exactly. That's brilliant advice.
Choose when to choose. And I think a third thing is just put arbitrary limits on how much searching you will do. So in the case of brick and mortar, I'm only going to go to 2 stores. And then I'm just going to choose the best thing I see in those 2 stores. And online, I'm only going to look at 3 websites. And notice how hard it is because it's so damn easy to just look at one more, right? But if you impose these limits on yourself, or I'm going to spend 20 minutes looking for a toaster, and at the end of that 20 minutes, I'm going to pick whatever toaster seems like the best and not worry about the rabbit hole I can go down if I decide to look at every toaster that's available on every website on the planet. So I think reminding yourself that good enough is good enough.
Good enough is good enough.
Having realistic expectations.
Setting arbitrary limits.
Setting arbitrary limits on how much searching you'll do, and sometimes letting other people choose on your behalf are ways out of this. The one thing I'm reasonably sure of is that no one is going to pass a law that says you can only have 12 different kinds of cereal in the store.
Exactly. You're always going to have 250 plus or whatever.
The world is going to pose this problem when we recover from COVID, whether we like it or not. And so the way to solve this problem is to bring a different set of skills and expectations with you as you make decisions than the ones that people had before. So I think these are helpful None of these things are easy to do. If you only look at 2 websites, you're going to be thinking, oh, just one more. Just let me look at one more. And you pick a toaster and you get the toaster and you go, oh, it's all right. But I'm sure if I'd looked at one more website, I would have gotten a better. So
you got to stop that. You got to grab that thought and stop that immediately.
You got to stop it, and you got to, focus on how, you had 2 hours free to read a book or watch a movie or have a conversation with a friend that you would otherwise have spent finding the best toaster online. So you gain an enormous amount, and the toaster you got is good enough. And after you've done this enough times, it gets easier and easier, I think, to follow these rules. It feels like less of a compromise with the way you think you're supposed to be.
Oh, I love that. It feels like less of a compromise. And I love all those strategies. And I think what you said there is also very valuable, is to phone up your friend when you're choosing that cell phone. What do you think? Or ask someone else. So set the arbitrary limit, but also what does it choose how you're going to choose? What did you say? Choose how many choices you want to make, and then choose when to choose, and then involve other people. Ask them for advice and that delimits it. I know you're a researcher, you write books, so do I. And I know for myself, I have to actually set a limit on how many research articles before I know it. I'll have, you can just keep on researching and never write anything. I have to tell myself, okay, that's it. I'm not looking at any more. That's it. From there, I have to make my decision. And if I didn't, I would never write anything. I would just research all the time.
And I hear too, the availability of information. You can now really pretty much read any article published in any journal without ever leaving your study.
Exactly.
And there's something great about that. It's a lot easier to get information than it was. On the other hand, when do you stop?
And then also you have so many. I remember studying at university in the 80s and having a limit in a library where you would have to go and get them printed out for you. Had a limit to how many, and you have to go to the library. So you would study each thing in such depth. Now you maybe had 100. Now you've got 1,000 or 2,000.
You read the abstract and nothing more.
And you can't get the same value out of it. So it's that in depth, we're going like this now instead of like this. And I think choices have done that to us as well. It's removed the depth out of our humanity, and then we become transactional. As you said earlier on, the humanity goes, and it's all about transaction and gaining data and just putting more notches in your belt, but you're not doing anything with that data, and that's very unhealthy for the brain and for society. Well, exactly, for the mind and the brain, the body, society, everything. Incredible. Well, the last question, I've got a million questions I want to ask you, but if I could ask you one more, what advice do you have for someone who may be experiencing a lot of mental distress after making the decision? Now, you've touched on this, but I'd love to, the buyer's remorse thing, you mentioned it earlier on, I should have done this. You have touched on that. Could we just take it a little bit deeper, maybe, in terms of maybe advice, strategies on, okay, I've made this bad decision about a house you've purchased, or the Airbnb, or the cereal, or whatever, or the romantic partner, or...
So there are a few things, and again, not these are not easy to do. You have to develop new habits. One is, we talked about this earlier, train yourself to focus more on what is good about a decision and a little bit less about what's disappointing.
That's so good.
You may still make a decision that's imperfect. You may still make a decision that you could have done better, but you will have a rich reservoir of positive characteristics of the decision that you can feast on. And, because of what I called negativity bias before, it's like a toothache. When you have a toothache, the whole universe is now on your tooth. Nothing else exists. So there's one thing wrong with your decision, and that's the only thing that exists. And the trick to get out of that habit and instead train yourself to focus on what's good about a decision, and that will lead to less buyer's remorse. I don't want to shut that out altogether. We do make mistakes. And
you just learn from them, yeah.
You don't learn from mistakes unless you acknowledge that they are mistakes. So
exactly.
So you don't want to, just be completely Pollyanna and treat, every day, every decision as perfect and every day is perfect. But training yourself to pay attention to what's good takes a lot of the sting out, I think.
I really like that. And the good news is that you say it is hard work, which is in this current quick fix society, people don't like that. They want a quick fix for everything. It's not going to be a quick fix. It's going to, with my research, I would tell my subjects and I tell my patients when I practice, it's going to take you at least 9 weeks per concept, per thought to change in your life. So that means focusing on the positive of a decision or whatever it may be.
The important thing is to appreciate that it's worth the work.
I love that. The important thing is to appreciate that it's worth the work. That's incredible. I have to ask you one last very quick question which relates to this. Do you think there's a connection between having too many choices and the problem of overthinking or ruminating?
Well, so I think what all these choices do is they push us to overthink. Consumer Reports magazine will have an article about washing machines, say, and they have 50 washing machines that they evaluate, and they evaluate them on 20 different attributes. Now, when I get a washing machine, the question is, in my mind, is, will it break? Does it clean the clothes?
And is it easy to use?
Yes. Then I read the article and I see, all these other things that I ought to be thinking about too. And I go, oh God, I didn't realize that this was a nuclear physics problem. I thought it was just how do I get my clothes clean problem. So I think that we're pushed to overthink because when the world gives you so many options, your task is to figure out how they differ from one another and which ones are the best for you. And that just leads to overthinking. And when overthinking stops you from choosing, I think that's when you get into this problem of ruminating, which, at least as I understand it, is basically thinking over and over again about the same thing in unproductive ways. So I don't think it helps to have all these options when it comes to overthinking. Analysis paralysis is the way a lot of people describe it. And also rumination. The way to avoid making a decision you'll regret is by not making a decision at all. There is no other way to avoid regret. We will all make decisions that we regret unless we don't make any decisions.
Exactly, and it's impossible not to make decisions because you're making them every moment of your day. So
time is itself a decision.
So you're always making decisions, so you may as well learn how to manage the decision-making process. So it's almost like when I hear you sort of in summary is we need to be almost delineating what am I looking for? Like you said, I'm looking for a washing machine. It must clean, it must be simple to use, so you go in with that objective and then you limit the amount.
The trick when you've done that is then to ignore all the other stuff. And it's really hard to ignore all the other stuff when shouting at you to pay attention to.
Especially because, as you said it earlier on, today's society, the story of America is all this, everything's best. You've got to make sure that you get the best. So there's this tremendous pressure to be the maximizer. And the story is that the maximizer is the happiest person. Meanwhile, as you've so clearly said, the maximizer is not the happiest person.
That is certainly true.
It's the satisfier, or whatever that word was. This has been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for your incredible insight and wisdom. I would absolutely love to talk more to you and invite you back again to talk more in depth about, because you've touched on some topics today that I would love to have gone deeper on today, but I really wanted to focus on decision. That'll be fantastic. And you've given us so much wisdom and so much advice. How can people find out more about you and your great books?
Google me, go to all the books are available on Amazon. I tend to have a very non-existent social media presence since I am not a fan of social media. I think it's really cheapening the discourse, and so I stay away. But, people will not have trouble finding me.
Not at all. You've got many TED Talks and millions of people who watch your TED Talks. We'll put the links to your TED Talks in the show notes, and you'll, as you say, we Google you, you're all over the place. So it's super easy to find you. We'll put information there, and your books are available wherever books are sold, and we'll put up some links to those as well. So thank you so much for your time and for a wonderful discussion. I've enjoyed our conversation so much, and I've learned so much. So thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Take care.
You too. Thank you so much.
Stay safe.